Okay, we're live. Uh,
Hello.
I wanted to start off today's episode just introducing our guest. We are so fortunate to have Dale Buscher with us here today. Dale is the Vice President for Programs at the Women's Refugee Commission. Women's Refugee Commission is an amazing nonprofit organization based out of New York, but global in scope. Dale himself oversees WRC's programs, gender and social inclusion, economic empowerment, and self-reliance, which we'll talk a lot about today. Also sexual and reproductive health, migrant rights, and justice. Dale's been working in the refugee assistance field since 1988 in a variety of capacities. He worked with Vietnamese boat people in the Philippines, later with Haitian refugees interned at Guantanamo Bay. He's worked with displaced Kurds in northern Iraq, with Bosnian refugees in Croatia, and with Kosovars in Albania and Kosovo. And he went on to work as the Director of Operations for International Catholic Migration Commission in Geneva. Over there, he saw the organization's $25 million international programs, which covered 20 countries and 800 staff. Dale has started numerous programs for the organization, including during extended field postings in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And additionally, he's worked as a consultant for UNHCR and wrote a field handbook entitled Operational Protection in Camps and Settlements. Very impressive resume and career, and we're really fortunate to have you here. So yeah, Dale, thank you so much for joining us, and we're gonna just kind of get things started because there's a lot to talk about today. I wanted to ask you first, tell us a little bit about how you began your work in the field of refugee assistance, kind of what inspired you to do this work in the first place.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks so much for having me. SITTI is one of my favorite organizations, and we're so pleased to be working with you all. So it's such a pleasure to be here. But back after I finished graduate school, I went off to Peace Corps. And what I got from that experience was that I loved working with, one, impoverished communities, but really people from different cultures and backgrounds. And so after that experience, I went back to the Midwest, where I'm from, and I knew that I wanted to work again with, people from different backgrounds and cultures. And so I was very intentional about looking for positions that worked with the refugees who were being resettled in the US at that point in time. And I ended up running a program for unaccompanied refugee minors, who mostly from Vietnam, but also Cambodia, a number of other countries, who the US and a number of countries had decided that, being in refugee camps was not a good place for these kids who were alone. And hence they agreed to resettle them. And so we ran a long-term foster care program for them while we tried to bring their families over from those, countries of origin. And so that's what got me started in this field. And after doing that for a few years, I was like, I'm on the receiving side. I want to know what it's like to be on the sending side. And I found a position in a refugee camp back in the Philippines, where I had been a Peace Corps volunteer, also working with Vietnamese who I'd been working with in Minnesota. And I decided I would go do that for a year, go and live in a refugee camp, really see what it's like on that side. And that year led to 15 years of these multiple posts that you ran into. It just got into my blood. I loved working with these populations. And so that's kind of become my career.
It's interesting for me to hear this, at least because I came into the field of working with refugee communities very differently than Noora, and so our paths obviously crossed at one point. But hearing your story, it's very similar in that respect, where you just kind of become very close with the communities you're working with, not really because of any direct connection familially or anything of that nature, but it really just kind of organically happens. And it's really amazing to hear just the career that you've built from that for such a long period of time. It's certainly not always the easiest work, and oftentimes, you know, there's not a lot of like there's not a lot of wins to celebrate all the time. You know, you're kind of like, it's a very much a roller coaster. How did you come into your role at WRC initially? You know, and if you can also explain a little bit about what WRC does, Women's Refugee Commission, for people who don't know.
Sure, happy to, Jackie. Thank you. So I was, as you had mentioned in your introduction, I was consulting with UNHCR in Geneva, and I was in their protection policy unit. And in that unit, one of the things I was working on was they had just started this new age gender diversity initiative. And they plugged me into that initiative to help them train up their staff around the world and roll that out. Well, lo and behold, the Women's Refugee Commission got a grant to actually partner with them on that initiative. And so at one point, the executive director of the Women's Refugee Commission was in Geneva, and she said, Dale, I want you to help us do it from our side, because we need somebody to do it from our side. And, you know, I wasn't convinced. It took a while for her to convince me, but what the selling point for me was, she said, you know, where you're going, one, you can sort of write your own job because we need somebody like you. But what I realized is all of those years of field work and all the learning about those harsh realities of field work, and then working at the policy level and realizing that, you know, the Women's Refugee Commission is a research and advocacy organization that's really focused on how do you make humanitarian response more effective, protective, responsive, especially for those populations who are most marginalized. So I was like, I can take this life experience that I've been granted and actually use it in a way that can help hopefully make change at a more systemic level than the positions I was in. You know, when you just focus on policy, like I was at UNHCR, implementation can often be a gap. And when you're doing the direct service, you're obviously touching lives, but you're not necessarily changing systems, right? And so the Women's Refugee Commission, because of its focus, really allowed me to get in that middle space of how do you influence an entire system to make it work better for everybody in these, you know, often, as you know, desperate situations.
I think that's a really, really core point. And I recall even at one point when I was working with UNRWA, sometimes you would see things that have been going on for decades. Like they would run systems that have been going on, you know, this is what they used to do, and this is how they've run things, you know, for 10, 20, maybe more years. And, you know, and you look at it internally and you're like, this doesn't work anymore on the ground. You know, things have changed, environments have changed, people have different needs. Why are we still working in the same, you know, why are the communities are still, you know, being serviced in the same capacity like they were 20 years ago? We need to change and evolve in our direction of how we approach people, whether it's how donor, you know, projects are implemented on the ground or whatever it may be. But it always boggled my mind, and I would actually get really frustrated of saying, like, why are we still doing it this way? And it was like, well, that's how we've done it. And it just was never like a good enough solution for me. I was always like, no, there has to be other ways to work with these communities, because when you talk to them on the ground, when you're, you know, when you're on that you know, that receiving end, and you have those conversations with people and they give you that different feedback, you're like, but why are we not listening to the same community that we're serving? And I think that's really, really key when you look at these different players and stakeholders in these communities, and of saying, okay, where do we come into play? Are we just servicing them because, you know, the money's there, we're implementing a project and we're just going ahead? Or is there something more that we can do to create long-term sustainability or support on that end? But I think that's, yeah, like just hearing you saying it also makes me think of, like, you know, my own experience of working with the community, and the difference between working at a high level headquarter, you know, UN level, like you said, policy, and just like speaking to donors and what they wanted, compared to like running our own, you know, social enterprise and having a nonprofit on the ground, working directly with the community, and then basing a lot of the work that we did from feedback we would receive, as opposed to just like this top-down approach.
Yeah, excellent points. I agree with everything you're saying. So
and I mean, now that you are on the more high level end of WRC, and I mean, how does WRC make that balance? You know, how do you strike that balance with, you know, establishing programs and understanding that those programs are serving the needs of the communities you're working with without, you know, falling behind, so to speak, like Noora was mentioning?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really good points. All of our program areas actually started based on the expressed needs of refugee and internally displaced populations. So we have this practice of going out and doing assessments around the world and really listening and really trying to engage a diverse group of refugees. So making sure that when we're talking to refugee women, we're talking to, you know, single female heads of household, elderly women, women with disabilities, etc., representatives of the various religious and ethnic groups that are there, and really try to learn from them what their priorities are and what their proposed solutions are. And so all of our programs have started from those kinds of assessments, like what's missing, what are those gaps? And we've really tried to then come back and regroup and say, how can we add value? How can we contribute to addressing that gap? And then all of our research is very much centered on bringing those voices in to the research and making sure, again, that, you know, we're doing focus group discussions with them, we're doing key informant interviews with them. And increasingly what we're doing is trying to partner directly with refugee-led organizations. But also what we've realized and what we have been practicing for about a decade now is whenever there's high-level events in Geneva, in New York, these UN events, like, yes, we have something to say, and we're going to work with the, you know, those constituents, those refugees out there, and find someone who wants to come and actually deliver their message in their voice around the topic that they've asked us to speak on, right?
Yeah. And you also, you know, this dovetails nicely, I think, a little bit into the topic of the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative. You know, talk a little bit how the RSRI, if you can speak to this, you know, how did that evolve? It seems like it did evolve from this need to have, you know, more measurement around self-reliance, but also to have more refugee voices at the table of these larger policy decisions.
Yes, thanks for the question, Jackie. Again, you know, I've started working on refugee livelihoods probably 13 or 14 years ago. And again, what would happen is I would go around the world, and it didn't matter which project I was doing research or an assessment on. Refugees continually said to me, we need jobs, we need to make money. If we have those things, we can take care of the rest. And the current programs that the NGOs are doing are not working. And I just kept hearing those messages. And so I came back, and I didn't have a background in livelihoods, but I was like, what can we do? How can we add value? And I started interviewing a lot of NGO practitioners, and they said, we know our programs aren't that good, our livelihood interventions aren't that good, but we don't know how to do them better. So I was like, okay, from where I sit, what I can do is I can glean all of the learning that's out there and pull it together and give it back in a way that's usable. And so with a couple of colleagues, I developed this field manual for livelihood programs in humanitarian settings. And it was really the first sort of hands-on. Here's the kinds of assessments you need to do. Here are the options for the kinds of programs you can do. Here's what you need to think about in implementing those programs. And that led to a whole bigger body of work around looking at the connections between livelihoods and gender-based violence, looking at livelihoods for urban refugees, looking at livelihoods for refugee youth. But in all of that, what I started realizing a few years ago is, I was like, this is all the front end. This is trying to help practitioners get it right from the start, but we don't know what it's actually achieving. So a colleague of mine, Kelly Leeson, whom you know, and I put our heads together and we're like, can we figure out how to measure the impact? Let's focus on the back end. What are these programs really achieving? Are they leading to change in refugees' lives? And so we got a small grant. We put together a pretty simple tool. We piloted it in Lebanon and Egypt and Ecuador. And then lo and behold, we realized that this organization up in Boston, Refuge Point, had developed their own tool that they were piloting with their program in Nairobi. So we said, let's come together, let's figure out what we've learned so far, and let's engage a much broader group of practitioners. And so we started bringing people together to actually build an index that we thought could measure things fairly quickly and easily and give us enough information to know how refugee households were doing. We wanted it to be simple and only focus on those things we really need to know. You know, as humanitarians, we usually want to know everything about a household, but we can't ask them to give that much time to us, right? And so that is how the Refugee Self-Reliance Initiative was born.
Yeah, I think there's ongoing improvements happening to the SRI and to the Self-Reliance Initiative. And, you know, I think it's a constantly evolving experience. It's constantly evolving tool. What are some of the,
I was going to also just mention, Jackie, like, if you recall, when we were looking internally as a social enterprise working with the refugee community, I remember like Jackie and I at one time asked ourselves, like, you know, does it really matter that we're there? Like, what happens if we close shop? What happens if like tomorrow we just, you know, after all these years of working, and you see communities and organizations working for years in these refugee communities. And it's like, well, what's the point? Are we actually achieving any positive results? And I remember like at one of our calls, we said, you know, does it really matter that we're there? And it was so timely. I remember, I don't know, Jackie, if you want to share, but you know, how when we came across the index, like we were like, oh, this will help us evaluate whether it makes a difference, whether what we're doing actually, what's the point? Because sometimes, and I think it was like right when COVID hit, things were really like, we were struggling. We didn't know like what was going to be next. And we asked ourselves, like, should we just continue or should we just close shop? And the process and the journey of us going through that was just like that beginning of us creating this like internal evaluation of like, okay, does it really matter? And I guess Jackie, you can like maybe share a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think like Noora mentioned, the pandemic was really difficult for a lot of small businesses. We're a small business, you know, I think a lot of people don't recognize that sometimes, but we're a very small business. And we had to take a very close look at, obviously from a budgetary side, we had to see what we could afford to maintain during a really difficult economic time. But then also we wanted to ensure that anything we were doing was really like the investment was making an impact. And a lot of small businesses don't necessarily have the capacity to create their own measurement tools. A lot of small businesses don't even measure their impact, which, you know, in and of itself is a very complicated and rigorous process. So for us, we were searching for this magic tool somewhere that was in the, you know, the ether. And it really was a serendipitous moment, I would say, when we came across the RSRI and what you guys were doing, because we hadn't seen any other tools out there. There was a lot of guidance on like, how do you measure your impact, right? And for us first as a social enterprise, but also as a social enterprise working with a refugee community, there wasn't a lot of niche tools out there. I don't think there were any. But in addition to that, we recognized in the whole process of searching for that tool, you know, everybody's saying, oh, what you have to determine what you want to measure. And for us, right, like we wanted to measure everything. We didn't want to measure just how many hours of work were we creating or how many jobs were we creating. That wasn't the point of SITTI. The point was
I
to
think
create self-reliance.
But if you recall, Jackie, a lot of the times when we worked with retailers and when we worked with other vendors, they always try to quantify, like, okay, so how many boxes of soap creates
Right.
X amount of hours of work? And for us, we never measured our contribution from that perspective of
Right.
like, you know, the women produced 4 bars of soap, and that 4 bars of soap equated into 2 hours of work, and that 2 hours of work equated into that. So we felt like we couldn't just settle with that equation of like, that was
Right.
so common when you're looking at social enterprise models, like, you know, 1 bar of soap equals this. And
Well,
we
because
felt
it's
like
it was based
there's
on,
more there.
yeah, it was based on project-based work. And I think it, you know, going back to what you were saying, Dale, about, you know, the old way of doing things tends to stick a lot of the times. And when it comes to social enterprise, the old way of doing things, or the standard, is paying per project or per piece of work you create, right? For us, that wasn't enough. We wanted to create long-term job opportunities where the community, the women we were working with, and the artisans we were working with, they were receiving a regular monthly wage that they could rely on, that was the same amount every month, and they knew was coming into their pockets. And so it was really, yeah, you couldn't say necessarily, okay, you buy 5 bars of soap, you're going to create certain amount of hours of employment, because they were working on other things even when they weren't making soap. Yeah. So anyway, I mean, I think this all kind of comes back to the fact that the tool, the Self-Reliance Index that you all have created has really changed the game for measuring refugee self-reliance, because it's a more holistic tool. It looks at all these different domains, right? And I'm curious if you can speak to, you know, aside from SITTI, because we use the SRI regularly, talking about maybe another organization that you've been working with that's utilizing the SRI, and what kind of, you know, findings or milestones have you experienced in this whole process, like an exciting moment since the SRI was created?
Yeah, thanks, Jackie. I mean, I have many examples. For example, one of our biggest partners in using it is the Danish Refugee Council. And their senior economic advisor said to me, she's like, Dale, we've been doing these programs, these livelihood programs, for 15 years, and we have no idea what they've achieved. And she said, finally, we can actually start measuring. This is going to actually help us start measuring so that we can improve what we're doing, because we'll know what those outcomes are. Another example is when we were doing some of that very initial piloting in Lebanon, one of our partners was actually a Lebanese child protection agency, you know, working with UNHCR on child protection. And their remit was really to get these out of school children into school. And they said, you know, until we started using the index, we couldn't understand all of those dynamics in the family that were impeding access to education. Neither parent had a job. The kid was out, you know, picking up rags on the streets to make money to bring into the household. And so if we just focus on trying to get that kid in the school without understanding everything else going on in the household, we're not going to succeed. And this index, using this index, is giving us a picture of all of those challenges in the household, but also some of those opportunities, right? And the impacts. And I think that's what we were trying to capture with the index is, it's not enough to know if mom or dad has a job. We want to know, how is that money benefiting the household and improving the well-being of that household? Does that mean their children are more likely to be in school, more likely to access healthcare when they need it, getting 3 meals a day? Is it leading to a more adequate apartment or shelter? And those were the kinds of things we wanted to learn. We really wanted to learn how income streams coming into the household were improving the well-being of that overall household, and how could we capture that and measure that over time to really be able to understand, are our programs delivering that? And if they're not, why not? what are we doing wrong? Is our targeting wrong? Is our implementation wrong? Is the program not the right program?
I think that's so important, particularly because when we're working directly with artisans, it's important to, when we're looking at analyzing and looking at our impact, it's not just that one person that we're dealing with. It's that person that's also tied to a network, to their family that has like, their village behind them or whoever is behind them. We've seen our artisans that have come into work, and while you say like, okay, we're creating, economic empowerment, or, so we're trying to promote self-reliance to this one person, we often forget, okay, well, what if this person came into this bubble or came into our enterprise with, so much debt behind them, or responsibilities that go beyond what, someone else's responsibilities are. And so everybody comes into the equation, or like even when we're working with them, we don't realize sometimes, I think, when we're thinking of measurement or like the beneficiaries that we serve, that they have, they have a bigger story to tell, whether it's, other responsibilities that they have, or, it's not just supporting this one child to get to school. Sometimes other things, like you mentioned, like there's other blockages and bottlenecks that are in that child's way that's preventing them from really being able to access programming. It's not that the program is bad, it's that there's other circumstances at hand that are not being considered when you're looking at like the bigger picture of things. And I think when we think of it from that perspective, we want to make sure that we're not working in silos. We're not really working, and it's like, not considering other situations in these communities, and we're not being blindsided by saying like, oh, well, we created jobs, we're good. Well, okay, but there are maybe more underlying issues that they're going with, whether it's like chronic illnesses that are, on the rise, or maybe they're having housing issues, or maybe they're having other things that they can't also resolve from this immediate job that they suddenly have.
And one thing actually that the SRI for us, for SITTI, has helped us understand more, what is, so, we have a certain number of artisans that we work with in the community on a regular basis, but then there is a community of over 300 members in that Jeddah refugee camp where we operate, who receive certain programs and livelihood support programming from the partners that we work with. So our CBO partners, including Hopes for Women in Education and the Community Rehabilitation Center for persons with disabilities in the camp. And what we have begun to understand through the SRI is that there are, first of all, and I think this is, people think this might be obvious, but it leads to the next point. Self-reliance is directly correlated with employment opportunities, right? So being able to rely on a regular income every month. But the other thing that we've realized is that there may be a correlation between a lot of households who can't go to a job place every day or every week and, leave the household, especially for women. So one thing that we've been continuing to evaluate for ourselves is how can we create employment opportunities for women who aren't able to leave their household during the day. And a lot of women, it's not that they don't want to leave the household to pursue work, but they might have 3, 4, 5 children, or they have another dependent who's an elderly person in the family who they need to stay home and take care of. So they can't necessarily just go to work for 4 to 5 hours a day at the workshop and then come home. So the SRI has actually really helped us recognize this gap. Now, we are a small social enterprise, so we can't just suddenly create 500 jobs all at one time and everybody can work from home. However, what we can do is take this information to larger players in the refugee community in Jordan, and that's actually something that we've been working with Refuge Point, your other partner in the RSRI, to do, is to figure out a way to present these findings to other players like GIZ, to UNRWA, and say, listen, this is what we're discovering. the numbers are here, the information is here for you, and it's based on these surveys that have been developed in a community of collaborating partners with real experience in the field. So, so yeah, I mean, I guess that's kind of like a thank you to the RSRI from us for helping us realize that. And, you know, even though we are pretty small in that respect compared to other larger players like the Danish Refugee Council, it makes a huge impact, certainly for us in the camp where we work.
I think, oh, sorry.
I was going to say, Jackie, I mean, you bring up a really good point, and this is really, that whole point about measurement was, let's get data and use that evidence to influence programming, influence policy, influence funding, because historically as humanitarians, we've often gone into situations and we act in good faith. We think we're doing good things, but we're not, programming based on an evidence base, right? And that evidence, when we start generating that, then we start learning about, oh, we should be thinking about this. Donors should be funding this. Host governments should be implementing these kinds of policies to create an enabling environment. And so that is really some of the core of what we're after, is developing, getting the data, analyzing the data, and developing the evidence so that we do better programming. We push donors to fund self-reliance work, in all of these situations, and we push host governments to create a more enabling environment. So that's sort of the big vision of where we hope to go with this initiative.
And I think it's really evident because we've seen, we've seen other social enterprises, we've seen other organizations come in and say, we're reaching, 1,000, individuals, but for us working directly on the ground, sometimes we're like, well, we can see the direct impact of serving one person compared to 1,000. So if you are truly serving these 1,000 people to this way that you're actually portraying or, relaying that information, you should see that impact on a larger community scale. And oftentimes you don't. And so that's why we're often like, maybe it's the marketing of it. Maybe it looks good on paper. And so yes, they're maybe having direct, contact potentially, or the beneficiaries reach X amount of people, but oftentimes there's a gap in how that information is portrayed, where it's like, we're creating 1,000 jobs, and I'm like, but it doesn't seem like there's any impact. Like the community still just as impoverished, just as in need. There has to be some sort of a gap where the numbers don't add up, right? Like sometimes the data says something, but then when you're on the ground looking at the improvements, there isn't any improvement sometimes. And you're like, okay, well, where's the gap? Where are we? What's the missing equation? And I think looking at data from a different perspective and looking at the information that's provided, it's not just about these like X amount of jobs created or X amount of, whatever. And that's something we've always been very conscious of in terms of like the data that we push out in terms of who we serve and how many people we're impacting.
Yeah, I think at the same time, right, and you could talk a little bit to this, Dale, from your perspective. At the same time, it can be when you're working in a community, especially a protracted refugee community, right, that's been there for 20, 30 years, in our case, literally decades. They've had a lot of humanitarian players come in and out, right? I mean, it's kind of like this game of ring around the rosy. They're just like, oh, okay, this is happening again. Like this other organization's going to come in and try and promise us some change and then leave. I mean, I would say as SITTI, we've been in Jerush camp, and Noora and I have been there for over a decade, but then SITTI's been there for over 7 years now, and we've seen a lot of people come in and out. A lot of these refugee households have also experienced the survey at their door. Can we can we survey you? Can you tell us some more information about yourself? And I'm sure, and I know this because we've had people say to us at certain points, like, we don't want to take another survey. This is really just, it's exhausting. And those households feel like they're not seeing any change. But I guess my question for you would be, how would you describe the Self-Reliance Index to a refugee family who's seen 1 million surveys in their lifetime? How would you say to them, this is different, why?
It's a really good question, Jackie. And I would say first, this really the index started with interviewing refugee households. I was out in Lebanon and interviewing refugee households, and really, even before we decided on the domains, the kinds of things we would try to measure, I said to them, if you were doing well and you felt like you were able to meet your basic needs, what would that look like? And they would be like, we'd live in a slightly better apartment than we live in. We wouldn't be worried about if we would have food on the table for dinner tonight. Our kids would be in school. I mean, it was the very things that they said. It's like, okay, that's what we need to measure. That's what refugees are looking at to let them know that they are doing okay. And so in introducing this to other refugees, that would sort of be my starting point. It's like this gives us, but it gives you a picture of how you're doing as a household. And the idea with whatever intervention is proposed, we want to be able to make sure that that intervention is actually leading to improvements on the very questions, on the very things we're going to be talking to you about. And I think the other unique thing about the Self-Reliance Index is it's not a series of questions per se, right? It's a conversation. And so the idea is you put the refugee at the center of that conversation and learn from them about how they believe they're doing in their household. Are you working? What kind of job you have? You really make it a conversation. So it's not, somebody coming in and say, I have 10 questions for you. But it's really more starting that conversation of, I would like to sit with you. I would like to learn from you. I would like to hear from you about how well you think you're doing. And then kind of introduce some of those domains as you're having that conversation.
Yeah. And I think this is similar with other organizations utilizing the SRI, but for us, what we've also done alongside Refuge Point and WRC is the surveys aren't actually implemented by Noora or I. Like we're not the ones going into the refugee households. It's actually members of the community who are trained to enumerate, to do these surveys and to go sit down with their community members and ask these questions and have these conversations. And then what they do is they also have the opportunity to add their own comments to that survey form, right? So I think that's also the really unique thing about the SRI is that, first of all, there's training available for the community members who are becoming those survey enumerators, right? So, we've worked with Refuge Point, actually an amazing member of the team, Ned Meerdink, who does a lot of the training and created now a digital version of it, but trained our team members to give that survey and to really identify certain red flags when they walk into a community member's household. But then also they start to put in their own observations. There's a separate section where they put their own observations in and say, yes, this is what they answered to the question, but then here's also what I'm seeing when I sit down with this community member of mine. I'm seeing, their roof is caving in, or they have, they don't have any food in their pantry, things like that. So, I think that's a really unique aspect of it as well, frankly.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that observation piece is critical, right? And that being there in the household and hearing from multiple family members and getting to know, it's like, oh, so the kids are in school, but Johnny's over here at home. What's going on? Being able to have those real conversations with people.
And I think working with sometimes the refugee community, like you mentioned, they've gone through so many surveying before. Sometimes they're just answering at the periphery of what that question is asking, but they're not kind of like digging deeper or giving more information. So they may be answering to like, maybe they had a good month, and the months that they answered that survey, they, may be at a different level than they are the following month or like the 6 months prior. And so sometimes just answering to the core is not enough. And these observations, I remember like when we were going through the results and just going through some of the questioning and some of the notes noted from our team, things were really like, oh, wow, like you know, we were kind of shocked, and I wouldn't say like completely shocked, but like there are some things that, you know, were brought to our attention. They're like, oh, this is something we need to address. And this is something that we need to identify. So I think that sense of observation, particularly when we're working with marginalized communities that have gone through, you know, decades of surveying across the course of their years, they're like, okay, I'll just give you what answer you want to hear, and then I'll move on. Mm-hmm. And sometimes we need to kind of dig deeper to really be able to say like, okay, are we really serving you to the best of our ability?
And I think having them know that actually the surveys repeated over time, it's like, we want to be with you on this journey, right? And we want the buy-in from those households to say, yeah, in 3 months or 6 months, we want with you to see that you're all doing better, right? And how we can help with our programming, how we can help with our referrals on those domains within the index where you're not doing better.
Yeah, it definitely, I think it gives off a sense of commitment, right? Like, again, you're not coming in and leaving after, you know, 6 months or a year. You're really committed to every 6 months, we're going to sit down with you, or every year we're going to sit down with you, have this conversation, have this discussion, and, you know, see where things are. And I think it also, it provides a tool, right, for communication, which I think the other thing is a lot of these families, a lot of these households don't really receive those tools to communicate their situation effectively. And from a policymaking standpoint, obviously we just discussed this, like there's a huge gap in that, you know, knowing what's going on in a refugee community and a refugee household, and then the people in the upper echelons of the decision-making power and people who are having those conversations with country and global leaders, they're not the ones necessarily who are sitting there having that conversation with the community. So, you know, talk a little bit about how the RSRI, first of all, I mean, how is the RSRI at this point now? It's been 2 years, right? A little bit over 2 years. How has the RSRI impacted global policy at this point? What are some of the changes or some of the major conversations that the RSRI has had with policymakers?
Yes, thanks for that. I mean, one, I can't remember if SITTI participated. You may or may not have, but we will get you next time if you didn't. But we certainly, you know, made quite a splash at the Global Refugee Forum.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, we participated in that paper.
Excellent. Yeah. Yes, and certainly I think what we've seen in really trying to push that Global Refugee Forum to say, yes, you put a pillar, and actually lots of advocacy from NGOs like ourselves to get that pillar in there, that objective in there on the Global Compact, that refugee self-reliance would be a priority. But then to report back on what all of, you know, the partner organizations are doing and how they're moving this forward, I think made quite a splash at the Global Refugee Forum. And in fact, it's been in UNHCR publications since. It's, you know, here's a good practice, here's an initiative really moving the agenda. But we've also seen, one of the donors for us is the US Department of State. And in their guidance now, their guidance for NGOs, they're like, if you're doing economic programs, we want them measured. The Self-Reliance Index is a recommended way to measure those programs. And they've even put it directly in some of those requests for proposals. Likewise, the European Union and UNOPS has this Lives in Dignity, you know, funding stream for refugee livelihoods. And they've recommended using the Self-Reliance Index for all of those grantees who are applying to access that fund as a way to measure the impact of their program. So I think we are starting to see some uptake there. And I think once we have more data, more evidence to draw on, we'll really be able to push, and we are having conversations about this. How do we push other donors to require their grantees to measure their livelihood programs, measure the impact of those programs? And how do we start, you know, generating evidence to really push those hosting governments to create a more enabling environment, right? We know the majority of refugees in urban areas are working in the informal economy. Sometimes that's where the majority of the host community is also working, right? But we also know that comes with a lot of challenges in terms of safety, in terms of opportunity, in terms of, exploitation, those kinds of things. And so how do we really push, use the evidence to push those hosting governments to say, you allow refugees to work. This can also be a benefit to your own communities. Everybody can win here.
Right. And I think that's always something that we're trying to bring the conversation back to, especially with host communities, is that, improving the livelihoods of refugees improves your livelihood too, because at the end of the day, you're building an economy that no longer needs to rely on humanitarian aid. Right. And that's a big deal. In Jordan in particular, a lot of the economic activity there is humanitarian aid based. Right. And so to be able to say to global leaders, look, if you are able to, first of all, start implementing the survey, not just with your refugee communities, but also with your own people, your own citizens who are also really struggling financially and, in general, are just struggling in terms of self-reliance, you can identify these pain points much more quickly and then act on them efficiently. And so, I guess, yeah, it's almost like the SRI it was created as a tool for refugee communities and measuring the impact in refugee communities, but it's now really become a tool for a lot of organizations in the host communities as well.
Yeah, we started with this idea of we just have to measure the impact. In doing that, we've evolved and said, well, if we measure the impact, then we can actually figure out what works where and with whom, instead of thinking and assuming that one program meets the needs of everybody who needs a program, right? But also to use that evidence to, again, push donors. Like most situations are protracted. You need to be funding livelihood programming to push self-reliance early and everywhere, right? Nobody should be waiting 6 months, 12 months, 5 years before they actually have opportunities for economic interventions. And then again, and using that evidence to push the host community. So in doing that measuring, what we've learned is we can actually have a much bigger impact, and we can actually start, we hope, contribute to transforming the humanitarian response. If we move from this response that's based on giving aid and seeing people as people with needs, to one that actually starts promoting self-reliance and creates dignity, reestablishes dignity, creates choice, creates opportunity, that could really transform how we do humanitarian work, right? And it could change this dynamic of, why are we providing humanitarian assistance to refugees who have been displaced for 30 and 40 and 50 years? Something's wrong if that's still the response, right?
I think that's so on point, because what happens is they're offering band-aid solutions that really are just helping relieve things at the core. I remember, I share this story often, but I remember being in the camp and visiting one of the women's homes, and she's like, come, I want to show you. And she takes me to her closet, opens the closet, and she literally had I think 50 warm blankets. And I'm like, oh, what's this? And she's like, every year they give out a blanket. And she's like, I don't want any more blankets. And it just was so we're looking at these communities, we're offering these aid solutions that are not sustainable. They're not helping dig at the core of what they really need. And they don't need another blanket. There's only so many blankets they can use in the winter. We need to kind of start thinking of other ways to help support these communities that, like you said, they're living in these protracted conditions that, we know that the average life cycle of a refugee is going to be over 20 years. Are we going to stay doing the same thing year after year for 20 years on the basis that one day they'll go back? And particularly with some communities where there's no solution in sight. So whether repatriation is not an option, and they now have to look at long-term solutions of being in that host country. And if anything, it actually saves donors money in the long run when you're thinking from that self-reliance perspective. Okay, if we're creating economic opportunities for these communities, they're going to be putting that money back into the economy. It's, you know, as opposed to here's just something at the bare basics of, you know, enough flour and sugar to get you going. But like, how can we go beyond that where they become, you know, positive contributors to the economy, to the host country itself, where, you know, donor money or, you know, funds that are coming in, you know, in the millions, is being put to use in a more effective, efficient way. And like you said, you know, ways we're not just at measuring impact for the sake of, oh, you know, how much money was spent or how much money was given out, but like, is it working? Have we improved from time, you know, from 6 months to now, or from a year from now, like, or are we just, you know, pushing it out because it looks good?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and you look at, even as small as a company as we are, you look at the hundreds of thousands of dollars we spend every year on employment. We put it into the economy through paying for shipping logistics, paying for the partnerships we have with other collaborators and the brands we work with in our subscription box. And I mean, that's money going back into the economy. And so why can't we, you know, figure out, why can't people wake up to this fact that you are going to, as Noora said, you're going to save yourselves a lot of heartache, a lot of economic depression, and a lot of dignity if you start to give these people opportunities instead of giving them a million blankets or a million whatever that they're just gonna like rack up over time. You know, I think this also speaks to the fact that we really want to try to get more refugee voices in this conversation, because at the end of the day, the part that we're talking about when it comes to policy changes and informed policy decisions really also hinges on whether or not refugee voices are part of that conversation, right? And you mentioned this earlier, Dale, which was like, we're really, the survey itself was based on the feedback you received from these refugee households in terms of what they define self-reliance as. Talk a little bit about how the RSRI is continuing to take measures to ensure that refugee voices are playing an active role in the decision-making process around policy and the advocacy work that WRC does, but also the RSRI and its partners are making.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I mean, we're really cognizant that we want refugees at the center of this. And again, you know, all premise, this whole body of work starting way back from when refugees were always telling me, we want jobs, we want to work, we'll take care of the rest. And that's the foundational kind of building block for all of this. It's like, let's give them that and they'll take care of their housing, they'll take care of their education. So we're very cognizant of trying to keep refugees very much a part of these conversations. Certainly, implementing the index really, I think, puts that household at the center. It's like, you tell us how you're doing and continue to tell us how you're doing. We're on this journey with you, right? But we've recently established a steering committee. We have, of our 12 steering committee members, I believe 3 or 4 of them are refugees themselves, because again, we want their voices in there. We've been doing trainings with refugee-led organizations to get them to start using the index. They've expressed a lot of interest. And so getting them to start using the index. And when we have done things at kind of the global scale, speaking at UNHCR in Geneva, speaking at events in New York, we always bring at least one of those refugee leaders or participants or clients into those events. It's like, you speak from your truth. You tell the story that you want to tell about if and why this matters to you. So that's how we're trying to stay true to that. I think there's obviously so much more we can do. And I think you guys, you know, would be a great example for us to learn more from about how do you center refugees in all of your work, and how can we collectively really start learning about how we pivot more and more to making sure that refugees are not only identifying the priorities, they're proposing and designing and implementing the solutions, right? And we should be backstopping that.
And I think it tends to be the default for a lot of organizations to say, we'll do this for you. Don't worry about it. Like you kind of take a seat back. And I think that it is an easy way to go about it. It's kind of like, there's so much systems change that needs to happen at the foundational level in order to prepare the way and provide those resources and opportunities for refugee members of the community to lend their voice and to really have a seat at the table, that a lot of times these larger organizations are just like, it's too much work for us to change at this point. And so I think that we're fortunate as a company to be small and nimble to a certain extent. It's still difficult, right? Because you're still operating within systems that are very antiquated and have this kind of colonialist mindset, so to speak. But I think that it's organizations like WRC and like the collaborative work of the RSRI that holds us accountable, right? Like that's what the RSRI does, or the SRI index does as well, is it holds the organizations accountable who are using it, right? So for us, we have to look at the hard truth of this is what the refugee members of our community are facing. And even though we're providing a monthly salary to these households, there's still major issues that they're dealing with on a regular basis that we need to also say, okay, if we can't handle this ourselves, how do we bring other people into the picture to support their needs and to provide those resources? Also, I mean, the steering committee, I just have to give a shout out to Amna, our M&E manager, who is part of your steering committee.
Right.
She was also on an episode of The Impact Room with Maisa Jalbout actually recently, and Filippo Grande, which was really exciting. So we have to plug her on this. But kind of in the final minutes of this conversation, and Dale, thanks again for taking so much time with us. Again, what's your message to other organizations out there who are working in the refugee self-reliance space, or who want to and don't really know where to start yet, or how to take advantage of what the RSRI has to offer?
One, we would welcome, we're open source. Everything is available for people. We provide free training for people, as you know. We continue to fundraise so that we can do those things. Again, my starting point is, if we get people sustainable livelihoods that lead to real self-reliance, we've done our job as humanitarians. And so anybody who wants to enter that space with that objective, as our community, we have our community of practice where we share learnings. We have calls every other month. And people, they're not just talking about the Self-Reliance Index, they're talking about all of their different economic programs. So we're all trying to learn together about how do we create a movement, and how do we really start transforming humanitarian response to one that really elevates the dignity of the refugee households, but also really opens up opportunities for them, right? And changes that dynamic from being dependent to being, contributing. And being able to make, we all want to make decisions for ourselves. We want to make decisions about what we buy, what we eat, where we live. Every human being wants that opportunity. And so anybody who can contribute to that, join us. It's not about the Self-Reliance Index. It's about changing the humanitarian response.
I think what we're hearing today and what we heard today, and that's really important for our listeners as well, is that this isn't something that just a small organization like SITTI is going through. This is something where on even high, like government level, UN organizations, large development or humanitarian organizations are evaluating and looking within and saying, like, are we doing an effective enough job? Are we actually creating that impact that is going to be sustainable, is going to be supporting these communities? It's not just, putting donor money down the drain at the end of the day and costing, more money and putting more of a burden onto these host communities. So what's kind of evident more and more as we talk about this is it hits all these levels. right? Not just on the micro, but really on the macro as well. And when we start looking at it from that perspective, we start seeing that ripple change. We start seeing how, you know, the economies really flow through. And that's where, you know, you feel like, oh, wow. And I know Jackie and I, we were actually talking about like, you know, what's a number? We were actually talking about this, you know, as, you know, as we set goals for our social enterprise, like, you know, what's a number that like makes sense for us? Like, where do we, at what point of our social enterprise do we say, you know, we've succeeded, we've done a good job? You know, at what point, remember we were talking about this, Jackie, we were like, at what point do we start saying, and we, both of us were like, it's not going to be a revenue number. It's not going to be like, oh, we had $1 million. Like, it's not going to be that. For us, it's going to be like, you know, what numbers did we actually impact on the ground? Like,
Yeah.
you know, how many refugees did we actually reach out to? What difference, you know, like when we, and this is again, as a social enterprise, that's kind of how our level of thinking was. You know, when we lead, it's less on the, you know, the triple bottom line, like how, like the, or I should say, like our bottom line of like how much can we actually get in terms of, you know, maximum profit as a company. But really, it's evaluating like, okay, how do we assess our level of success?
Yeah.
Where do we know, okay, we've gotten to a point where like, all right, we did a good job. We can, I don't want to say we can stop, but like, all right, we've reached that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great place to end on. And Dale, thank you again for joining us. We're going to have more information about WRC in the links below this video. Also, we're really excited to be working with WRC on our next subscription box. They'll be featured inside the box. So thank you so much for being a partner with us on that. And yeah, thank you for being here again today. I know your time is so valuable, and we're just really grateful. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for having me again. You know, we're so thrilled that SITTI found us and that you guys are a part of this community, and just so impressed with what you're doing there on the ground.
Thank you.
Major kudos. So thanks for having me.
Yeah,
thank you. I'm actually giving just a sneak peek of what, you know, our upcoming box is going to have, only like one tiny element, but there will be more information about the WRC in our upcoming subscription box. We're so excited to have, you know, more information there. So you guys will see more information. There's also other goodies, but I'm not revealing too much, but I did want to share this beautiful postcard that's going to be in there. So again, Dale, thank you so much for taking the time. You know, there's so much that we're learning all the time, and also opportunities for us to continue to improve and look at ways that we can, you know, do the work that we do, but even better, you know, inshallah, like, so thank you so much. Thank you, Jackie,
Thank you.
as always. I think we're going to have this also up on our website with a blog, right?
Yeah, we will have show notes and everything available for
Okay.
our email subscribers and everyone. So thanks again. And
Awesome.
yeah, we'll see you next month, I guess.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Dale. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.